if I may, I actually had a question for you, and you told me, very wonderful surprise, that you are now somewhat more into MMT since you met. Can you tell that story? Can you just what happened? That, you know,
I mean, I don't know if there's that much of a story, but sure. I mean, you know, when Graham Elwood and I were doing our tour of Australia, we met up with a couple. I guess you would say well, they're professors, and I guess you could even say
MMT economists, absolutely.
MMT economists.
Stephen Hale and Phil Wan, is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you know, great guys, and you know, talking to them was just so humbling because they are just so crazy intelligent. Like they're just so I felt, you know, like I felt very dumb talking to them, but not in a way that it was like I didn't feel bad about it. Like I felt awesome talking to these people. You know what I mean? Like I felt like they didn't make me feel dumb because they were like, peasant. They're just like, hey, this is what we're passionate about, and we're gonna just like open up your mind and tickle your brain a little bit, if that's okay. Teachers. Amidst a couple pints. Yeah. And good ones at that, you know? So yeah, it was a really cool conversation. And Stephen recommended the book Debt, which I read. That was how I opened my 2020. That was my first book of the year. That's great. Which I feel like it's a very intense book. And I reached out to the author's publicist. I forget, I think David, I forget his last. Yes, Kramer. Thank you. Graeber. Graeber.
Graeber.
Yes, that's right. Graeber. Yes, thank you. It's an intense book, but I mean, it's one of those books, and I hope he agrees to do the show. I'm a little intimidated by it because I want to ask good questions. But you know, it's like, how do you narrow down the questions you'd want to ask this guy when he has this? I mean, that book was like,
well, it's
how many pages?
Oh, it's like 600 pages. I read the first 7 chapters, and it was a bit much for me as well. But what it's about is a major foundation upon which MMT is based. One of the major foundations upon which MMT is based, and that is the state theory of money. It's chartalism. It's called chartalism. State theory of money is the false idea that many people have, is that we had barter, and that it became so complicated that governments would then come in, or they would create governments in order to make that bartering system easier, and that's where money came in. That's not what happened. There's no historical evidence to show that. No major economies have ever run on that. And this book is not just a book. It's an anthropological, like, super documented, like there's a whole, like, probably 100 pages of sources in the back.
And just to clarify here, like, for anyone listening who's like, well, wait a second. He wasn't saying that bartering never, ever happened.
No, not at all.
He was just saying that, like, yeah, it happened on like a micro level and between neighbors.
Cigarettes in prison.
And it was, sure. And it was to an extent part of an economy the same way it is now. I mean, that happens now. What he's saying is it's not like that was the big man on campus, so to speak. And all of a sudden, innocent old government and the innocent old ruling class was like, gee, this is just too complicated. And the guy who has chickens maybe isn't as lucky as the guy who has cows. We got to figure out a better way to do this. Here's some money, people. It didn't work out that way. It was more like, hey, we need to find some way to just like maintain the social order and get what we want. So here's this idea of money, even though you guys already had different currencies that had its own value. Maybe it was salted fish, maybe it was whatever else, but we're going to come in with money because this is kind of a better way for us to manage things. Because I think, and let me know if you agree with this, maybe you do, maybe you don't, and you're more into this than I am, but I think there's a component of MMT that is just basically like one of the bylines of it. There's many bylines of it, but one of the bylines could just be, yeah, a lot of the stuff you're taught about money isn't necessarily completely wrong, but is very, very incomplete.
Well, this is what it is. Everything you're taught about money, some of it's just plain wrong, but a lot of it
sure.
is just upside down. Just turn your understanding upside down and you got it.
Well, even in like the first chapter of that book, I mean, I was ready to just put my yellow vest on and start running out in the street. I mean, just like this whole thing where you're taught, and it even goes back to biblical times. So like it's ingrained in our heads. Pay your debts. That's what you owe to society. A man with debts, like what's wrong with you? There's a
Jesus
problem.
died for your sins, so now you are in debt.
Now you're in debt. Yes, that's in like the first chapter. And he goes, why is debt a one-sided thing morally? Why are you the person holding the debt? You have this huge moral obligation.
Before you're even born.
Before you're even born. But the person giving the debt, the person which by the way, they didn't actually give you anything. I mean, especially in the case of a bank, they're just printing stuff and handing it out because they have the authority to do so. They didn't take a hit here. Why do they have why is there no moral obligation when you see an entire generation of people not able to buy houses, some of them not able to start families because of this predatory loan practices for student debt? Why is there no moral obligation there to cancel that stuff for the betterment of society? We know the answer to that, Jeff, but it's like, that's one of the things that people never take a step back and think about it and say, you know what? Screw this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's the foundation. That is the seed that everything else, every other understanding comes from. And the twist of that is the seed that every other myth comes from. The idea that taxes pay for stuff, the idea that the deficit and the debt and fiscal responsibility and how you're going to pay for that, that all comes from the idea that the state theory of money is wrong and that it actually was barter. That's where it actually comes from. And it takes a long time to sort of understand that. But you, as someone that has read debt, you can sort of start to see that connection, that is the seed, the idea of barter and the idea that money is valuable within itself, as opposed to a contract that defines a relationship, and the relationship is valuable. If the money itself is valuable, that is the barter, that is the not state money story, and that is the seed upon which all of the lies are based. That's where the household analogy comes from, that pretending that the government is just a super big company, as opposed to the upside down entity, the God, which is a completely different story.
So now we're in this situation where, they have said on TV now, like it's out in the open, where they're just like, hey, how did you give the banks trillions? And they say with a straight face, oh, we just moved the decimal number. We just moved it. And then we were like, here's trillions, banks. So now more and more people are realizing, oh, wait a second. You can just hand the banks trillion by moving a decimal point, a la the movie Office Space. You could also do this.
That really an Office Space? I have to see that again now.
Well, kind of.
I didn't know MMT when I saw it.
No, well, yeah, kind of. Like that's what they did. They did a thing where they got like a fraction of the decimal point in their own bank account. And they were going to just kind of skim pennies here and there for years and make money off of it. But he moved the decimal point too far.
I vaguely remember, but I didn't know MMT at the time.
So they basically committed a big. Oh yeah, no, you can totally use that movie as like a conversation piece, I think, and all that stuff.
Well, finish your thought. I interrupted you.
No, that's it. But
the core is another one. The core. You see the core?
I have not.
There, you know what I'm talking about? It's a very silly adventure action movie. It's just a dumb, fun movie where the core of the earth has stopped moving, Ron.
Okay.
So they have to drill a hole tens of thousands of miles down to the core, as if that's possible. And they have to send some nuclear bombs to start the core of the earth to move again, as if that's going to make a difference. So this guy says, I've worked on this technology. I just don't have the funding. It'll take about 12 years. And so the guy from the government says, how much would it take to make it happen in 3 months? He's like, $50 billion. And the guy says, will you take a check? Yeah. So yeah, it's the same thing.
We can actually do that. And we could do that to fund things that actually help people.
Mm-hmm. I want to go ahead.
No. And I was going to say, and Stephanie Kelton explains how that would work just with basic note cards, where she's like, look, you put all these note cards into circulation. Well, these other note cards are being used for this, and this. And this is how MMT works.
Right. Regarding the trying to get this fed. Can I get this? There we go. I just put a link into the comments. I just a video with Graham that I did, wonderful video that was just released yesterday, actually talks about the Fed, like you just mentioned, because yes, the government did give the rich tons
Mhm.
and us hardly at all. But it is not accurate to say that the Fed gave trillions to the banks. They did in a sense, but they only did it because the banks gave them that exact amount in return. It was a loan. They didn't just give bankers money, just handing us a check. And I go into this in depth in this video with the Graham. I just put the link in the description, in the comments. So it is true, the overall statement that the government gave way too much to the rich and hardly any to us is absolutely true. But the specific that the Federal Reserve gave banks trillions, they did, but there was a condition on those trillions, and that the banks had to give that exact amount back in their treasuries.
Well, explain the nuts and bolts of that, because I mean, at the end of the day, it's kind of like, and Peter Joseph went into this a good bit in his new movie, and I think Debt goes into this a little bit as well, where it's like they're basically just scratching each other's backs, more or less.
Well, I mean, to give them cheap loans is definitely a help, but that's very different from saying we're just giving them trillions and they can do whatever they want without them having to give anything back. So giving you money, giving you a grant without, just like a paycheck, you did your work, but you have your money and you can keep it and you can do what you like and no strings attached. You don't owe it. That's a net financial asset after you pay your taxes. What's left is your wealth. That's your wealth. That's your net financial assets. That's what I'm calling it. Okay. That's very different than a loan.
Right.
So yeah, a loan, if a loan, even with 0%, that's helpful, but that's quite different than just giving you a net financial asset, just giving you a grant. So the Fed is absolutely helping the banks in that way, on top of all the coronavirus relief that the Congress is doing, which is just giving money to people straight. That's bad. That's absolutely just not good. But what the Fed is doing outside of that is giving loans to the banks. And yes, that's helpful. And we should have low interest loans as well. But we just need to understand that is not just giving free money like a check, like a grant. It's very different. It is a loan. It is a one-to-one asset swap. It's a swap of assets, one-to-one, an even swap. So it's just not quite as egregious. Like the anger is right. It's just that particular example is not an example of what we're upset about.
Well, I think there's more to it than that as far as what we're upset about, because really what they did, instead of just giving direct relief to people, which is something that you need to do in this case, they just kind of gave it to the banks and said, hey, deal with it. Give it to the people.
No, that's
and in
true.
a way, it was just to enhance the wealth of it. Because, I mean, keep in mind, the entities we're talking about, I mean, the big banks in this country, I mean, they have an endless runway. I mean, they're not going to run out of money anytime soon. It just keeps going. So this is just, this is just another decimal point for them.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, as part of the bigger picture, there's no doubt. You're exactly correct. And also why are they doing these loans? Because what have they been doing for the past 10 years since 2008, except for continuing to screw everyone and not saving? Mm-hmm. So now they're running to the Fed and to the government saying we need a bailout. And so, they are getting free money from Congress because Congress is telling them to do it, but they're also getting these low interest loans, which also help. I mean, it's a different kind of a help. But, it's to a significant degree, this coronavirus bailout, as I see it, is really just an excuse to just bail out the banks for the past 10 years, bail out the big corporations for the past 10 years, not just the loans, but also the bailouts that is going mostly to, actual assets, actual net financial assets, free money to these corporations because they haven't prepared. The government hasn't prepared. They haven't made the corporations prepare. They've continued to screw the people, and they're bailing them out again under the guise of coronavirus relief.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's what they're going to do with a lot of that loan money too. They're going to use it to be predators to other people, which they already have.
That's true.
So what would you say? And then we're going to go to the video in just a second. But what would you say is kind of the big, like the big nuts and bolts lesson people should take away right now in relation to what MMT is, what it is all about, as it pertains to the current pandemic we're facing?
Well, let me say very generically first, and that is a new sort of elevator pitch, and that is you have to understand the truth in order to be able to properly understand what the solution is and how to stand up properly and how to refute the lies and understand that you're being tricked. And so my version of the truth, like there's all kinds of ways to look at the truth. Like, you know, a gemstone, you look at it different angles, it looks different, but they're all valid and it's all different angles of the truth. My particular angle that I'm interested in focusing on is economics. MMT is the truth about economics. So what we see as economics, like you can't escape your prison unless you could see the walls around you, and you can't defeat the beast unless you know its nature. So we know that something's wrong, but unless we really understand the nature of what that problem is, we don't even know what direction to face in. So we can't even know what the solution should be. So as I see it, MMT is a lens, a glass lens that you look through, that when you're not looking through it, you see just nonsense. You see just crazy, complicated, everything's too hard, dark. And then when you look through this lens, it makes sense. The economy, the federal finance, it makes sense. And that's what MMT is. It's looking through that lens so you can see it as it already and has always been. And it cuts through all of those myths. So that's a generic answer of what I see MMT as. And some economists will say this. Bill Mitchell says it's a lens to see the economy as it actually is. As far as coronavirus, there's like the rent strikes. People are desperate right now to pay rent. And that the landlord, and we'll set aside the issue of people need homes, shelter to survive. So why do we make them pay for things that they need to survive on a day-to-day basis? Let's just set that aside. People have to pay their rent. Landlords depend on that rent. Landlords can't pay their bills unless they get that rent. Those vendors of the landlord can't pay their bills unless they get that income. So it starts this massive, like, sort of matrix of a cycle, and it creates this vacuum of people needing that money. And that vacuum is, by definition, what makes it possible for the federal government to safely issue the currency to pay that rent, to pay the landlords, to pay all their vendors, and on and on and on and on. Because the currency issuer is the only one who can backstop that whole cycle such that everyone in the cycle is left whole. No one else has that ability to create money. And since they can create money, they can fill that vacuum of need during this crisis that no one else can. So the fact that they're not doing it means that it puts pressure on states to have to do it, puts pressure on municipalities, it puts pressure on people to have to demand it, which puts pressure on landlords and all of these entities. So pretending that they can't create that money puts pressure on everybody else, which makes people fight each other, and it just creates a big old mess. But the vacuum, that need, is what by definition means that the government can safely create it without causing economic problems. And in fact, what's the only bad thing is that they're not doing it. It's like saying, you know, it's not that we can't afford Medicare for all. What we can't afford is this horrendous system that we have now. We must do it. We must do it to stop all of the suffering. And they must pay this rent, or I would say more MMT economists, I think, would be more towards just pay wages, pay everybody's wages, 100%.
Yeah. Well, that's what they're doing in a lot of other countries.
Right.
I mean, in England
80%,
right
even
now,
in England, even though they have Tories,
80%.
they're still paying 80%. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think eventually I was talking to Gordon Dimmick about a week ago. He's a YouTuber in England, and he was saying eventually it's going to be like 50, but for the next few months it's or potentially it's going to be 50, but for the next few months it's 80%. And then they've basically just frozen payment like that, like they've just completely just and I think I think freeze means, you know, they just put it on hold and then you owe it all later. And forgiveness just means it's just not a thing right now, and that's what we need. We just need the forgiveness where it's like, yeah, you can't pay rent right now. So landlords don't have to pay mortgages. You don't have to pay rent. And as you're saying, the government, can, create this, not, the Fed, like they can create this, and then it's just completely forgiven. Correct.
Right. So they can pay it and fill that vacuum,
Mhm.
or they can pop the vacuum on the other end so that you don't have to fill it at all.
Mhm.
Or you can do a combination of the two. There's a lot of different ways that you can do it, but the only one that can do it is the central government, the issuer of the currency. They're the only ones that have the power because they can afford to spend more, even though they don't currently have more, because they don't have anything. They have the ability to create, but they don't have. No one else has the ability to create on demand, so they're the only ones that can backstop it. But how they choose to do it, there's a whole bunch of different ways to go about it. On the back end, on the front end.
Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You can tweet me an article at Ron Placone. We'll go through it together and make it our own. Get your news